All right, today we have another episode from the archives with one of my incredible guests. Enjoy. All right, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to help trauma therapists be their incredible selves, to be human, to be real, not just a clinician. I'm a big believer in who we are is more important than what we know. And this requires cultivating authenticity, genuineness, and vulnerability, and that requires intention. You can learn more about my courses and workshops by going to thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. Let's get started. All right, guys, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson, and very excited to have as my guest today, Irene Lyon. Irene, welcome.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much.
So Irene Lyon is a nervous system specialist who helps people release their deepest traumas from their nervous system, allowing them to finally heal from chronic mental, physical, and emotional conditions they've tried everything to fix. Irene has intensively studied and practices the work of Feldenkrais, Peter Levine, Kathy Kane. She has a master's degree in research in the fields of biomedical and health science and regularly appears on podcasts and online summits teaching all things nervous system health, healing trauma, and neuroplasticity. Awesome. All right, Irene, before we dive in, where are you calling from? And where are you from?
Yeah, I am. Yeah, it's easy. I'm originally from Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. Okay. And I've lived a few spots in my life, up in the mountains of Whistler, British Columbia. I don't know if you know Whistler. It's a big ski resort. Yeah. So I was there for a while. That's part of my story. And then lived in Australia for a few years. That's where I did my research. Oh. And now, full circle, I've come back to my hometown and I live literally a 15-minute walk from the hospital I was born at. Wow. Back in 1975. So wow. I walk by that hospital almost every day, and Vancouver is truly home. Yeah.
What an interesting experience to be living near the place that you were born in. So we start usually with a quote or a mantra. Do you have something you want to share?
Yeah, it's interesting. I picked this quote up back in 2000 when I was doing my research, doing a lot of reading Einstein and alchemy, like lots of more mystic sciences, if you will. And I don't know if you call this a quote, but it's something that the alchemists, and not the book that Paulo Coelho wrote, but like the true alchemists, what they lived by. And I will say it in Latin. I may not do the Latin justice, but it is ora, lege, felege, labora, e veni. And that means ora is pray, lege is read, relege is reread, labora, work, e veni is and you shall find. So I remember when I found that, I was still deep in my studies, doing health sciences and at the time actually recovering from some physical injuries due to ski accidents I had had in my early 20s. And so I was doing a lot of searching and a lot of trying to figure out things and how come my initial bachelor degree, which was in health science and exercise science, why that work actually wasn't helping me heal. I was, trying to heal these orthopedic injuries and about 7 years of education and rehabilitative education, and I still didn't know how to help myself. And so there was this element of what am I missing? And that's when I kind of got first piece into kind of the more somatic world, if we want to call it that, was with the work of Dr. Feldenkrais, Moshe Feldenkrais. And so that was sort of the launch pad to me going into what some people might call alternative healing methods. And yet, if you really look at the people that I have studied with over the last 18 years, they were all really hardcore scientists. Feldenkrais being one, Peter Levine being one, and then my more recent mentor, mentor is Kathy Kane. So yeah, that was where the alchemist really got me. And I still to this day think of that when I work with my online clients. I always make sure they know of that saying, if you will, because the one thing I've really learned in this healing world is we have to keep learning and we have to keep working at it. And if we keep putting those pieces together, we eventually find what we're looking for, if that makes sense.
It does, yeah. So once again in English, so it's pray, read, reread, work, and you shall find.
Yeah.
I love that. So you touched a little bit about your skiing accidents. Was that how? Did that start the engine into getting you into this field with trauma and so forth?
No, it wasn't.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's weird. So quick story. So I was a big active kid in my teens, and long story short, had a whole bunch of knee ski accidents. So common things are the ACL, cruciate ligaments. But the big one was I fractured my kneecap, my patella of all things, which was a complication from another surgery. And that threw me into a bit of a tailspin more physically because my body was all crooked. I was on crutches for a long time. So I was physically kind of twisted, and yet I was strong. And so I got into the Feldenkrais work, and the Feldenkrais work pretty much fixed all of the physicality problems. And it was so miraculous to me at the time that I decided to study Dr. Feldenkrais's work. I did that, and I started private practice. This is when I was still living in Whistler, British Columbia. But in about 2008, this is where the trauma piece came in. I was doing my private practice, doing mainly Feldenkrais, and I would say about 40, this is a rough estimate, but maybe about 40% of the people I was working with were getting better in the way I had. Mm-hmm. But there was sort of this 60-ish%, if I'm really honest, to be honest, Guy, maybe 70, if I think about it, that weren't getting better. And they might have a nice experience. They might increase their range of motion, but there was like something that didn't stick. And it's as if they weren't really there. They couldn't sense their bodies. They couldn't take the work on their own. And when I started to look at the histories of these people that weren't getting better, they all had some kind of either highly traumatic experience, injury-wise, accident-wise, or they had had some fairly big abusive adversity when they were young, and not just physical, sexual kinds of abuse, but emotional abuse, always having to be perfect, always having to be top of the class, which is a high strain on a lot of kids. And so I was looking at this spectrum, and I was like, well, what am I missing here? And luckily, when you go back to the alchemy quote, I asked questions, and I just talked to some of my mentors in the Feldenkrais world. And one actually said, you might want to look into Peter Levine's work. And I was like, okay, so I did. And so I got into Peter's work in somatic experiencing in about 2008, which is about 10 years now, isn't it? And and I went in knowing I needed to do it because it was really clear that this underlying dysregulation of the nervous system was why these people weren't physically getting better, because their system was essentially in some kind of survival mode. And I got into that work, fell in love with it, and then realized, lo and behold, oh, maybe I do have some traumas in my system that I didn't know about, that were deeper than even my physical injuries. And I grew up in a very loving, caring household. It was just the societal pressures and the expectations, the things that we kind of take as common rule in our Western society, but when you really unpack them, you really see how they stunt an individual's authenticity and their growth and their ability to be real and emotional, right?
Yeah. I'm raising my hand here.
Yeah, well, I'm sure everybody could. And I really stress that because a lot of people get scared by the word trauma, and really trauma it doesn't have to be some big thing. It really is, if I define it in Peter Levine's terms, it's dysregulation of our autonomic nervous system. And right now, I have yet to have met anybody, and this is the truth, in my life, who is fully regulated in their nervous system before they get into this work. Our society just doesn't allow for it. So that's kind of how I got into the trauma work. A lot of the folks I know in that field get into it for themselves. I was kind of the opposite. I got into it for my clients, and then through that went, oh wow, this is important. For not just my clients, but myself.
What was it about, or what is it about you that wanted to do this work? I mean, initially when you were studying the Feldenkrais method, why did you make that jump from having your own experience to saying, you know what, I want to work with people? What was it about, or is it about you?
If I'm really honest, I didn't want to be a hypocrite. I had, much to my parents' dismay, they had just put me through almost 7 years of university. That's not including my master's degree, to become highly trained to work with humans at the rehab level, the nutrition. I was trained in nutrition, exercise science level. And I was watching my own body not get better with all that. And I was trained by some good teachers in university. And I was like, what is going on here? And I was actually raised in a medical family. My parents are both veterinarians, both animal doctors. So I think there was always this essence of finding the solution. And I knew darn well that if I didn't keep searching for the thing that would help me, at least in that primary moment in my Feldenkrais years, if I didn't figure out what that was missing, I wouldn't have, to be simple, job satisfaction, right? And I was already kind of getting a bit frustrated with the classic way of training people and doing exercise rehab, all the core work and stretching and strengthening. And while exercise and staying strong is essential, the way in which we physically rehabilitate people is quite primitive. And so I just knew there was something more to it. And so that's kind of one of the reasons why I kept pursuing that. And I've been asked this question before, what drives you? What makes you want to do this? And it's interesting. I was just with my team. I have a team of about 10 people that help me with my online work. And I said, I never woke up one day and said, this is what I want to do. Right. I don't want to work with, I want to work with trauma. I want to do this. It was never a choice. I would say that the choice kind of found me, the work found me, and then I just chose to make the decisions that brought me to, you and I sitting here and having these convos. So it's all very strange.
With your study, initial study with Peter Levine's work and so forth, and quote unquote trauma, how did things shift for you in the way you interacted with your clients or approached your clients? Yeah,
that's a big one. Well, are you familiar with Norman Deutsch? He's a Canadian author, psychologist, psychiatrist. Deutsch. He wrote one of the first
brain book, right?
Yeah.
Was that Deutsch?
First book, yeah, his first book was called the Brain That Changes Itself.
Right. Yeah, Norman Deutsch. Yeah,
2004-ish, and that was sort of one of the best, if not the best, books on neuroplasticity. So the fact that we can change patterns that are deeply, deeply wired. We used to think if someone had a stroke, that was it. You couldn't rehabilitate anything. And we now know that's not true. Same even with spinal cord injuries, Parkinson's, and all these things. And so he wrote that book in the mid-2000s. And then he recently wrote his latest book, which I actually prefer, is called The Brain's Way of Healing. And in that book, he actually talks about Feldenkrais, Dr. Feldenkrais's work. So if anybody listening wants to learn more about Moshe Feldenkrais, I would say that he has 2 chapters on him in that book, is probably the best account of his work. But what he also has in that book is a chapter on what he calls neuroplastic healing. And he dubs it the 5 stages of neuroplastic healing. And when I read that chapter, I would say that a light bulb really went on, in that he outlines the importance of sequencing how we heal. So I'll give you an example. So when I was doing my Feldenkrais work with my clients in my private practice, the people that weren't getting better with the physical Feldenkraisian work, which is quite complex. I'm not sure if you've ever done any Feldenkrais work, but
I haven't. Yeah.
It requires higher brain functioning, because you're listening to an instruction. You have to feel it in your body. You have to process that movement pattern, and then you move. So it's high level. And in the sequencing of how we work, for higher function to be 100% sort of on, if we are living in survival physiology, so if our nervous system, if our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems are kind of chaotic and in disarray, our brain, and not just our brain, but our entire physiology, will be consumed by survival. And when we're consumed by survival, we can't think with our higher brain, or we can, but it's kind of half-ass. Right. And so when he outlined, like, before you do more, what he calls neurodifferentiation, that's the 5th stage of neuroplastic healing, which is Feldenkrais work. So before you could do this higher level neuroplastic healing, that's neurodifferentiation, you must work at the lower levels. And he calls it neuromodulation, which is where you're basically learning how to regulate your nervous system and not be living in a state of threat all the time. And so what I realized was, like, oh, this is why out of a class of 10, 5 people leave feeling lovely and they keep it. And the other 5 are confused. They think they might have got something. They might have a little better flexibility, but they come back the next week and nothing has changed, right? Nothing has stuck. Am I making sense?
Yeah, it makes great sense. I think it's a great illustration too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So these folks, well-meaning, and this is where, if you talk to a lot of people now, and I'm being very general, they've tried diets, they've tried yoga, they've tried meditation, they've tried positive thinking, so positive psychology, gratitude, all these very higher, we would call them higher brain behavioral modifications. And they come up short. They might get better for a little bit. It might help them strategize, cope, and manage. But if their underlying stress physiology, it's more than the brain, it's actually how our neurophysiology responds to our internal state and to our environment. If that's still on fire due to past adversity, trauma, stress, never being able to be yourself and having to protect your system, if that's still running the front of the bus, we can't be higher brain. And so when I read that chapter, what made sense to me was, this is why now when I work with my clients and we take the time to teach them how to regulate, how to become more safe in their system, they then can take on the higher brain stuff with ease. It just kind of comes like easy. Whereas before, with that stress physiology running the front of the bus, it really is indicative to that kid in school who's labeled ADD or learning disabled. It's not that they're stupid. It's that they are struggling with survival energy and they can't focus. They can't concentrate. And this is the same with adults. If you have an adult that is highly stressed or is still stressed from, past early traumas, they'll struggle in life. It'll be hard to get things done, to get motivated. We hear the word resistance all the time, right? I've got all this resistance, and often that resistance, that lack of motivation, that malaise, that fatigue, that anxiety, it is, and I'm pretty confident now because I've done this enough, it is that unresolved traumatic response, or to be more appropriate, traumatic responses that are still sort of sitting in their cellular system, if you will.
I mean, you can just imagine people going through, trying different things to heal themselves and things not working, and then turning to, addiction or getting depressed and so forth. And the other side of this coin too, I mean, thank you so much for that explanation, is such a great argument, if you will, for, new clinicians, people just starting out to learn trauma, to learn trauma-informed interventions and modalities and so forth. Let's share with us an early clinical error, because everyone has them. I'm sure you've had some.
Where I screwed up.
One.
Yeah. Because I'll be transparent. You sent me this question, so I was like pondering that. And it's almost, it isn't one person per se, because I could think of some people that, they could have done this better, that better. It's more of a kind of this, it's a theme. And so this is the theme, and that's that you get people coming in, whether it's my private practice or my colleagues' private practices or my online work that I do. And if someone thinks that just showing up at my office or someone's office or doing an audio exercise is enough. So they do it and then they leave, but then they don't integrate that into their life. If they don't integrate it into their life and have their entire life be a mirror by which they can work on their physiology, their responses, their stress, it's hard to heal. And by that, I mean, it's kind of like this all or nothing thing. And when I was young in my career, I was a little more afraid to say it how it is, like to be a bit more of that hard-nosed, like if you don't change these elements in all of your life, it really isn't, it's not that it's not going to make a difference, but in essence, it kind of isn't. And some of the more primary examples I'll give is, we'll have someone come in who is chronically ill. Let's say they have fibromyalgia, and which is, as we're learning, basically a dysregulation of the nervous system, and which is due to early traumatic stress that was never treated. And so you have this individual, and so we do really good work together. We might work on their stress physiology, bringing their survival energy down, teaching them how to feel that in their body. Maybe there's some specific events, maybe a car accident, maybe it was abuse, and we work on that in the office. If they then go back to their current life that has been set up based on their wiring, meaning they have, let's just say, an emotionally shut down partner, or their children who are, say, adults, walk all over them. They don't know how to set boundaries. Maybe they have kept a job that is soul sucking and doesn't give them enough time to rest. All of these things, maybe their dietary changes don't change. So many things. So they just go back into that world that was created as a result of their early traumatic patterns. If that world doesn't change, and this is going to sound harsh, but it's kind of true, there's almost no point in doing the work. And the reason why I say that, and I'm becoming more comfortable saying it, is we want people, I want people to do their best, and I want to give them the benefit of the doubt that they can take that tough love, if you will, that harsh reality. And it's hard, it's hard if you're a person in your 60s or 70s and you're sick and you have a very set way of living, and to extricate yourself from that might be financially impossible, let's say, or you have children, these sorts of things. So it's kind of like this all or nothing. And if you go into this work, it really requires an entire lifestyle change. And then the other one that I'll speak to is I'm starting to mentor more colleagues. And because I think a lot of people that listen to your podcast are in the therapy realms. Mm-hmm. And what I've seen too, and I'm getting a bit more brave at speaking out about, is if you are in the work, if you're doing this work with your clients, right, it is essential that you yourself are in the work too. Mm-hmm. And I'm blessed that my current husband is also trained in somatic experiencing. He got into it after me. So our way of living and our environment is very much open in terms of being emotionally vulnerable, supporting each other when we're having a hard time, all these elements that we would do with a client, such that we're living that life, that world, if you will. So to go back to your original question about an error or a mistake, I don't know if that's a mistake, but more in retrospect, I wish back in my younger years, I could have been a bit more diligent at really almost having an intake with my clients to say, if you want to do this work, this is what's going to be important. And if you know that this isn't something that you're going to change, then either A, we might not be the right fit, or B, would you be willing to consider changing these things? Right. Because it's like, I don't want people to feel that they're, it comes down to people have to pay for this work. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know if this is making any sense. It's not like a specific, but it's this need to really convey to people, this isn't just 1 hour that you come in, we do work, and then you leave and you forget about it. Like, it really needs to be this 100% green light. And it might mean that every now and again the person pauses from the work, but they're still in it, in a sense, if that makes sense.
It does. I mean, what came up for me as you were sharing that, Irene, was this, a lot of times I think when people are starting out, there often is, and certainly with myself, there were a lot of hesitancies around certain things. And it almost brings up this idea of, people get into this field oftentimes because they want to help. And that can mean fixing and curing and stopping the pain. And
yes.
But what happens when, you said something happened where there was a hesitancy about, you used the phrase kind of tough love. But to me, there's something very open and straightforward in expressing that. That to me is a very interesting kind of transition that a lot of us made. And you said you got to that point where you were able to just speak more openly about that. And I found that very empowering. And it's interesting because on the other end of that, oftentimes there is someone, if we're talking about trauma here, people who've been impacted by trauma, who, how are they receiving what you're not saying versus when you're able to explain and open up to them, and it lands differently in a sense. I find it very empowering. I don't know. I appreciated what you shared.
Yeah. And I'll add to that. It kind of, it's very adult, right? It's kind of this, when we've got trauma in the picture, we're working with a physiology and a brain that is infantile or in a child state or, adolescent. Like there isn't full maturity. And this is actually something that Dr. Feldenkrais was very interested in, is what is a full mature human being, and does that even exist yet? And he died a long time ago. He was doing his writings in the 50s. And, one of my whys, one of my big desires, and I've sort of borrowed this from Peter Levine, so I'm going to credit him, is that we as a species, as a human species, stop living in survival. And in order to do that, some very tough discussions and tough healing regimens have to occur. And what you said a second ago about like the danger I see a lot of people getting into when they're doing this work and they want to help people is getting into the avenue or the road, if you will, or the track where you're helping people so that you feel good. As a therapist or a practitioner or a massage person or whatever. And it's a very fine line, because when you are doing your work so that you feel good about yourself, it kind of poisons things a bit, as opposed to doing your work with your client and being proud of their accomplishments. It's very much, in university, we learned something called the sick model of health. And there's this great image of this man like in a ditch, and he can't get out of the ditch. And someone's throwing him pills. Like, here you go, here's another pill, try this. And then it's superimposed with another image with the man in the ditch, and the guy above is like giving him a hand and helping him get out of the ditch, as opposed to just throwing him stuff. Mm-hmm. And I think at least as I mature, and I consider myself still young in this work, but as I look at how do you sustain this work and how do you keep going, you really have to, I believe, this is my opinion, see the work as you're kind of a catalyst, and there has to be very little ego involved. And to do that means being sometimes the tough love person, still being empathetic, and giving people the benefit of the doubt, like hoping and desiring and having the intention that they will take the tougher path that will actually probably give them more ability to become, as I like to say, their own medicine. Like, I don't want to be the crutch for someone. It gets tricky when clients need to see you every single week. And some people do need that because their systems are so dysregulated. But even in that case, there needs to be a good boundary and a good separation, that they are also doing their own work when they're not with me or with their therapist. And that's kind of how I actually see very few people one-on-one anymore. I do mainly group work, because I saw how powerful it was when people took the learning and the healing into their own hands, and they had more peer support as opposed to me being that single person that's quote unquote fixing them, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
I think,
does.
and I think there's a place in the rooms for fixers. Like, if I had a broken bone, I want to go to a fixer. I want to go to a surgeon that's going to fix my bone. But for a lot of the stuff around trauma and healing the psyche and chronic illness, the approach I'm seeing is very different. And it's more than just working with people and helping them feel better. It's getting them to learn how they can make themselves feel better, if that makes sense.
It does. Yeah, I mean, yeah, we can go on and on with this.
I know.
And I really enjoy talking with you. I just want to remind everyone that I'm speaking with Irene Lyon. Her website is irenelyon.com. That's IRENELYON.com. Let's talk about, let's kind of segue into what it is you do. I mean, I'm looking at your website now, which I love, by the way. You have programs, you have free resources, you have events. Let's talk about, pick something out that you can share with our audience.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I don't do very much private work anymore. If I do, it's mainly with practitioners who are needing consultation and their own sessions. And what I'm mainly focused on now are my online programs. So that kind of came out when I was with my private practice people. I would send them home with audio lessons that I had recorded, just guiding them through their nervous systems, being able to sense, feel. And at the same time, I was also doing a lot of lectures and talks, teaching people like detailed information about their nervous systems and how stress comes in and how the biology responds. And so over the course of about, I'd say 3 years, give or take, a few months, I started to amass all that content into an online program.
Okay, just to be sure, these are programs for what? For clients, people? Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So it was kind of like when I was first starting it, it was just an experiment. I didn't really know what I was doing. But I knew that people needed something when they weren't with me, like they needed to learn and they needed to study. And so I started creating these audios, these handouts, articles, videos. And then over the course of about 3 years, I put them into a more formal online program that is now a 12-week program. It's called Smart Body, Smart Mind. And we just finished actually a round. It's the 7th time I've run this 12-week program. And people basically go through, it's really like going to a university course in some ways, in that you show up each week for an online lecture. There's Q&A calls, so it's like going to your tutorial. There's readings, there's video trainings, and then there's the practical where they listen to an audio, I call them neurosensory exercise, and then they do that lesson. And that work is really a unique blend of Peter Levine's work, my other mentor, Kathy Kane, who is well steeped in early developmental trauma, and then Feldenkrais work. So to describe it in words can be maybe confusing, but essentially I've curated and amalgamated those 3 pieces of work into this program. And so far we've had well over, I should know the numbers, well over 1,000 plus people go through it in over 40 countries worldwide. Wow. So and then the people in that are a mix of people. Some folks have severe chronic illness. Others are like myself, like you, who want to learn a bit more about the nervous system, trauma. Some people are practitioners who are still healing their own wounds, and so they're in there. But all sorts of folks have come in and really benefited from kind of that amalgamation of the work that I've been kind of piecing together for the last 20 years, really.
So that, again, is called Smart Body, Smart Mind. Mm-hmm. Okay, I'll have this linked up at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. Awesome. Yeah. When's the next what?
Intake?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we do that. Right now, I run it once a year. Okay. Up until 2017, it was twice a year, but I'm wanting to get back into doing more mentorship and live events where I'm teaching more Feldenkrais sort of movement. So we run that every spring. So it's going to go again in spring 2019, most likely around the first week of April. Okay. Last March, yeah. Okay. And then the other side is that because I know there might be folks who want to get started right away, we do have a smaller self-study course that was curated from the 12 weeks. That's a 21-day kind of tune-up, we call it, nervous system tune-up, and that could be started at any time. So someone who wants to start that could do it today if they wanted to.
Irene, how about a go-to book recommendation? I'm going to list up here Norman Doidge's book.
Yeah, Doidge's are great. They're very great stories. He's a great writer. I had two books in mind. So one, and of course, Peter Levine's books are a given because he's one of my mentors, but the two books that are less known, or maybe not, one would be When the Body Says No. That is a book written by Dr. Gabor Mate. Mm-hmm. And he's a physician based in Vancouver, actually, but he's become quite well known for his work on addiction, ADD, and chronic illness. So When the Body Says No is a wonderful read. It's a hard read for someone who might be living with or trying to heal a chronic illness, but it really goes into the stress interactions and the consequences of emotional repression on our physiology. So that one's a good one. And again, beautifully written with lots of stories, which I always like. And then the other book is called Scared Sick. Scared Sick.
Scared Sick, okay.
Scared Sick. And that's written by a science writer named Robin Carr Morse. And we didn't talk about this, but there's so much information online, and I have articles on this. But that book dives into something called the ACE study. I'm not sure if you've had anybody talk about the ACE study. So that's the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And that really is the seminal piece of research. It's kind of like the Framingham heart study that showed connections with heart disease back in the 80s. This is like the study that has really shown without a question that early childhood stress, when that is left untreated, will cause mental, physical, and emotional illness later in life. Addiction, cancers, arthritis. That book, I think, is probably one of the better books to break that study down in a way that isn't too scary. It has the science, but it also has lots of stories. It's just a really well-written book for someone who wants to learn more about these interactions of childhood stress, adversity, and illness later in life.
Awesome. So those two books again, When the Body Says No, Understanding the Stress Disease Connection, Gabor Mate, previous guest on this podcast, and then Scared Sick, The Role of Childhood Trauma in Adult Disease by Robin Carr Morse. Irene, what's the best way for people to get in contact with you?
My website, really, irenelyon.com. All my social feeds are there. We have a pretty robust Facebook community, too. It's called Healthy Nervous System Revolution. I think we've got about 20,000 people in that group. And so that's moderated by my team of about 8 people. People can ask questions related to the nervous system. It's about education. It is not group therapy, but it's where you can get a lot of good resources. I've got a YouTube channel that you can find on my website that's been called Binge Worthy, which is always funny to me that trauma videos could be binge worthy, but apparently they are.
Nice.
And then I've got a blog also, and I'm kind of all over the place. I'm on Instagram. I'm doing all that stuff.
Okay. Yeah. Irene, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. It has been a long time coming, and I appreciate it.
Thank you.